This update explains debt, discussing the history of debt over 5,000 years of human society, written by the renowned American anthropologist David Graeber. The book has 540 pages. I am going to walk you through the essence in around 25 minutes. Before we dive in, please click on the subscribe button below the video and stay updated. Who is David Graeber? I specifically consulted a friend specializing in anthropology, who informed me that David Graeber was one of the most famous public intellectuals in this field, very active on social media before his death. Graeber was also one of the organizers of the Occupy Wall Street movement, and it's said that the slogan "We are the 99% was proposed by him. Due to his involvement in Occupy Wall Street, Graeber was dismissed by Yale University and later became a professor of anthropology at the London School of Economics. David Graeber passed away suddenly in September 2020 at the age of 59, and Debt is considered his most important work published during his lifetime. Additionally, Graeber authored the best-selling book Bullshit Jobs, where he introduced the famous bullshit jobs theory. So what exactly does Debt discuss? Let's start with the title of the book. What does debt mean? Literally, owing debt means one owes something to someone else. However, Graeber argues that not all owing can be called debt. Owing favors, gratitude, or having responsibilities are different from financial debts. There are two distinctions. First, favors, gratitude, and responsibilities cannot be precisely calculated, just as we can't exactly determine how much we owe our parents. Whereas a financial debt can be precisely calculated, just by knowing the principal, interest, and penalties. Second, favors, gratitude, and responsibilities are tied to specific individuals and cannot be transferred, while financial debts are depersonalized and devoid of emotional significance, and can be transferred or circulated. As debts must be precisely measured and circulated, currency becomes essential. Graeber believes that the essence of money is not to act as a general equivalent commodity, but as a unit of measurement for debt, just as meters measure length and seconds measure time. Initially, money was merely a virtual unit used to measure debt. A history of human debt is also a history of currency. In this book, Graeber presents many revolutionary ideas. For instance, we typically believe that human society started with bartering, gradually developed cash transactions, and eventually evolved into credit economies and virtual currencies. However, Graeber points out that the actual history is the opposite. Human societies started with credit economies and virtual currencies, and only later developed cash transactions, with large-scale bartering emerging much later. Understanding this reverses our grasp of the main thread of human debt history. Let's delve deeper into this. The first part. Any economic textbook will tell you that human economic interactions began with bartering. This notion originates from Adam Smith, the father of economics. Adam Smith believed that humans have a unique nature of bartering, using one thing to exchange for another, which is the foundation of all human societies. In Adam Smith's view, primitive societies operated like this. In a hunting tribe, all men went out hunting together. Over time, one hunter discovered he was particularly skilled at making bows and arrows. If he focused solely on making bows and arrows and exchanged them for other hunters' game, he would gain more than if he hunted himself. Thus, this hunter became a specialized craftsman. However, there was no currency back then, and his peers could only barter, such as exchanging a bow for 2 goats or 10 rabbits. Clearly, bartering was inconvenient, so people began to use shells, metals, and similar items as mediums of exchange, and thus currency was born. In summary, this is a story of primitive people gradually transitioning into individual entrepreneurs, fitting well with our modern imagination. The inconvenience in transactions was even packaged by economists into a sophisticated term called transaction cost. The only problem is that this common-sense story finds no basis in anthropology. Graeber states that for centuries, people have been searching in vain for the kind of bartering tribes described by Adam Smith. From the records left by missionaries, adventurers, and colonizers, no primitive tribe operated on an exchange a bag of potatoes for a pair of shoes economic model. How did these primitive tribes actually operate? For example, in an African primitive tribe, most items were stored collectively in a warehouse called a long house, where goods were distributed by a council of elder women. If a tribe member, let's call him Little Peter, needed a pair of shoes, he wouldn't need to trade a bag of potatoes for the shoes. Instead, Little Peter's wife would request from the women's council, who would then retrieve the materials for making shoes from the warehouse. Now Little Peter has his new shoes. When his neighbor John sees them and expresses his desire for the shoes, what happens? Does John offer a bag of potatoes for Peter's shoes?
No.
John simply compliments the shoes, and Peter might respond, "Hey, these are just some poorly made shoes by my wife. Since you like them, take them." And just like that, John gets the shoes. You see, it's that simple. The bag of potatoes never even comes into play. However, now John owes Peter a favor. Later, when Peter needs something, he can ask John for an axe, a basket of eggs, or something else. If Peter really didn't want to give up his shoes, he could refuse, and then he would owe John a favor in return. In other words, in a small-scale, acquaintance-based society like a primitive tribe, people kept a mental ledger of who owed what to whom, but they didn't settle debts face-to-face through bartering. Instead, they allowed these favors to accumulate over time. The book provides an interesting example. An anthropologist once gave a beautifully crafted knife to a member of a tribe. A year later, upon revisiting the tribe, the anthropologist discovered that over the past year, every member of the tribe had owned the knife at some point. This means that because of this knife, everyone owed someone a favor, and everyone was owed a favor in return. Goods in these tribes circulated through this system of favors. In such a tribe, saying a person owes nothing to others is not a compliment but a criticism, indicating that the person is unfriendly and antisocial. Of course, primitive tribes did occasionally engage in bartering, but not with their own members. Instead, they bartered with strangers or hostile tribes, where the exchange meant settling the transaction once and for all, with no further obligations or responsibilities between the parties. Since this was the case, why not try to take advantage of the other party during the transaction? Indeed, this often happened, and linguists have found that in multiple languages, including English, French, German, Spanish, and Portuguese, the term barter has connotations of deception, fraud, or trickery. This further confirms that bartering was an occasional phenomenon, not a societal norm. So, did human societies ever engage in large-scale bartering? Yes, but not in primitive societies. Instead, it occurred in modern societies. Familiar with cash transactions, modern people, lacking sufficient currency due to various reasons, would resort to bartering. For instance, when a country's economy suddenly collapsed and its currency drastically devalued, people would turn to bartering. This happened in Russia in the 1990s and Argentina in 2002. Moreover, prisoners of war camps naturally engaged in bartering when no currency was available, exchanging cigarettes for bread or coffee. Eventually, cigarettes became the most popular item, and thus the universal currency within the camps. In this case, the development of currency from bartering perfectly fits Adam Smith's theory of the origins of money. But remember, this happened to modern humans. In primitive societies, there was no systematic bartering, so how did currency emerge? Anthropologists have found that the items used as currency in primitive tribes were varied, commonly including shells, feathers, beaded necklaces, whale teeth, and items like brass rods or purple wood sticks. Notice that, contrary to what we might imagine, the earliest forms of currency were not practical items like salt, barley, or tobacco, but decorative items that served only to enhance one's appearance. For example, shells, feathers, and necklaces were worn directly. Brass rods were used to make copper bracelets. Purple wood sticks were actually a type of red pigment used as makeup. Interestingly, these items, though they could be considered primitive currencies, were not used in everyday transactions. In other words, people in primitive tribes did not use beaded necklaces or whale teeth to buy potatoes or eggs. What were these currencies used for then? Anthropologists have discovered that they were primarily used to rearrange relationships between people, most typically in marriage and funeral customs. For instance, many primitive tribes had a custom of providing a bride price. A male suitor would bring valuable beaded necklaces and whale teeth to the woman's family. If the woman's parents approved, they would send their daughter to the man's home. Does this mean the man bought the bride with a substantial sum? Most anthropologists think not. If this were a purchase, it would imply that the husband had absolute power over his wife, including the right to buy, sell, or even kill her. However, in many primitive tribes, the relationship between husband and wife was essentially equal. So, what exactly is the nature of the bride price? Anthropologists believe it is a way of acknowledging a debt of favor. The man's substantial bride price signifies that he acknowledges the value of what he is asking for is so precious that it can never be repaid. Similarly, when a murder occurs within a tribe, the murderer's family must pay a compensation to the victim's family, also using currency, like whale teeth or brass rods. This does not mean that the payment can buy a life, but it signifies that the murderer's family acknowledges a debt that can never be settled, thus avoiding a blood feud. An interesting side note is that in English, the word payment derives from the idea of pacifying emotions, calming anger. Okay, let's review the two main points we just discussed. First, primitive societies did not engage in systematic bartering, and economic interactions among acquaintances were based on mutual favors. Second, currency did not develop from bartering. In primitive societies, currency was not used for buying goods, but for creating, maintaining, or severing relationships between people. In other words, the emergence of currency had nothing to do with commodity transactions. It was a completely independent system. Now, the next question is, when did currency start being used for everyday commodity transactions? Let's continue discussing this. The second part. In this book, Graeber uses a unique perspective to re-examine the entire history of human civilization, focusing on whether money was used in daily transactions. Based on this criterion, human history can be divided into 5 stages. The first stage spans from 3500 BCE to 800 BCE, covering over 2,000 years of the earliest agricultural empires, corresponding to the Sumerian civilization. During this era, currency was mostly a symbolic accounting tool, rarely used in everyday transactions. In other words, human civilization actually began with credit economies and virtual currencies. The second stage spans from 800 BCE to 600 BCE, lasting over 1,000 years, known as the Axial Age, the era of Confucius, Siddhartha Gautama, and Pythagoras. The large-scale minting of coins began suddenly during the Axial Age, and currency started being used in daily goods circulation. The third stage spans from 600 CE to 1450 CE, lasting over 800 years, commonly referred to as the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, currency gradually disappeared from circulation and was extensively stored in temples, churches, and other religious places, leading society back to credit economies and virtual currencies. The fourth stage spans from 1450 to 1971, which Graeber calls the Great Capitalist Empire's era. Due to the discovery of gold and silver mines in the Americas, the world began to extensively use gold and silver as currency again. This era lasted until 1971 when U.S. President Nixon announced the decoupling of the U.S. dollar from gold, marking the return of virtual currencies and the beginning of the fifth stage in human history. You see, the entire history of human civilization is a history of alternating appearances of virtual and physical currencies. This is Graeber's core insight in the book, which I need to elaborate on. Let's look at the first stage, the earliest ancient agricultural empire era. On the Mesopotamian plain, the birthplace of Western civilization, the Sumerians used cuneiform to leave a complete set of credit records and currency information. The basic currency unit for the Sumerians was the shekel, with 1 shekel of silver equal to 60 portions of barley, exactly the monthly wage of a temple worker. Clearly, the shekel was not developed from market transactions, but was directly regulated by temple administrators, the government officials of the Sumerians, used to measure the wages of workers. More importantly, the shekel was a virtual currency unit. 1 shekel coins did not exist in the market. Silver was not commonly circulated in the daily lives of the Sumerians. Silver bars were tightly guarded in temple warehouses, rarely taken out. Sumerians used the shekel as an accounting unit, or more academically, a measure of value, recording who owed what to whom. For example, a Sumerian farmer going to a tavern to drink would simply give his name for the bartender to record the account, and he would settle the bill with barley or other agricultural products during the harvest season. An ordinary Sumerian farmer, except perhaps during his wedding, would never touch a piece of real silver in his life. In other words, the Sumerians developed from a primitive favor economy to a credit economy, relying on a credit system, which Graeber believes was the earliest form of virtual currency in human society. Notice this contradicts our common sense. We usually think that human societies first had large-scale cash transactions, then gradually developed a tool called credit, and only then came virtual currencies. However, the reality is that ancient agricultural empires operated on a credit system and virtual currencies from the start. So, when did human societies transition from virtual currencies to large-scale coinage? This brings us to the second stage of human history, the Axial Age. One peculiar fact is that the places where Axial Age saints lived also saw the sudden emergence of large-scale coinage, such as the Yellow River Basin where Confucius lived, the Ganges Basin where Siddhartha Gautama lived, and the Aegean coast where Greek philosophers lived. Previously, large amounts of gold, silver, and copper stored in temples and palaces suddenly flowed into the public, split and minted into small coins for circulation. Why did this sudden change occur? Graeber's answer is that governments strongly promoted the circulation of currency. The Axial Age had one major characteristic. It was filled with violence and warfare, such as the long-term conflicts among ancient Greek city-states. Taking ancient Greek city-states as an example, due to prolonged warfare, many Greek city-states needed to maintain an army of tens of thousands of mercenaries. Just finding and transporting supplies for these people required hiring an equal number of workers and animals, which was a heavy burden for the government. Moreover, the government's forced collection of food and other supplies from the public was highly inefficient. What to do? The best solution for the city-state governments was to issue silver coins as military pay, then declare that taxes and fines within the city-state would no longer accept goods but only silver coins. This way, soldiers could use silver coins to buy anything they needed from the public, and the public was willing to exchange goods for silver coins because they needed them to pay taxes to the government. Thus, under the strong push of militarized governments, the ancient credit economy disappeared, and currency became the main player in goods circulation. There's an example to prove Graeber's deduction. In Greek city-states that maintained large mercenary armies, coinage was the most widely adopted. However, in places that relied on trade rather than military power, such as the Phoenician city-states, known as the ancient Western world's most formidable merchants and bankers, coinage did not become widespread. The earliest coins minted by the Phoenicians read, "For military use only." This further confirms that the large-scale use of currency for goods circulation was not a spontaneously generated result of a free market, but was strongly enforced by militarized governments. However, during the Middle Ages, the trend of currency being widely used for goods circulation reversed, and the credit economy and virtual currencies returned. Why did this happen? We know that the world's major religions such as Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism were all born during the Axial Age, but their widespread adoption occurred in the Middle Ages. The widespread adoption of religion had an unexpected consequence. the reduction of precious metals in circulation. In the Middle Ages, most of the coins ended up in religious places like churches, monasteries, and temples. Some were directly buried, some were melted down to plate altars, or cast into sacred vessels and divine images. This caused a severe shortage of precious metals in circulation, leading to vicious deflation. In history, there were several large-scale campaigns to eradicate Buddhism. Graeber believes that one important motive of the government was to regain precious metals for coinage. In Europe, the response to the disappearance of coins was a return to the credit economy. We know that in the early Middle Ages, Charlemagne conquered most of Western Europe and unified the measurement system, setting currency units such as pounds, shillings, and pennies. Although his empire quickly disintegrated, for the next 800 years, throughout the Middle Ages, Western Europeans continued to use this currency system for accounting. During the Middle Ages, pounds, shillings, and pennies like the Sumerians' shekel were a virtual currency system, separate from the various actual coins circulating at the time. In the daily lives of medieval Western Europeans, most transactions did not require cash but used virtual currencies for accounting, with a small amount of coins as a supplement. So you'll find an interesting phenomenon. Medieval kings of various European countries frequently recalled coins for reminting, but this did not greatly impact the daily lives of ordinary people. It wasn't until around 1450, when Europeans discovered gold and silver mines in the Americas, that the situation began to change. The discovery of American gold and silver mines marked the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the great capitalist empire's era. We know that most of the American silver flowed to China. The Ming Dynasty was a period of population explosion in China, but it was also a time when the living standards of ordinary people significantly improved. The Ming government needed a large amount of silver as currency. After Europeans discovered the American silver mines, China began to export large quantities of silk, ceramics, and other luxury goods to Europe in exchange for tons of silver. By the late 16th century, China was importing 50 tons of silver annually, accounting for 90% of the silver produced in the Americas each year. The rest flowed to Europe. From that time, countries in the East and West entered eras of silver standards, bimetallic standards, and gold standards. In other words, the great capitalist empire's era, like the Axial Age, saw large-scale use of currency for goods circulation. However, Graeber also reminds us to note the fundamental differences between the two eras. During the Axial Age, currency was just a tool for empires to maintain control, but by the great capitalist empire's era, currency itself seemed to have a will, with the governments and armies of capitalist countries organized around money, and financial logic itself in a dominant position. Graeber points out that this global monetization process was interrupted again in 1971. In 1971, U.S. President Nixon announced that the U.S. dollar was officially decoupled from gold, ending the Bretton Woods system, marking the return of virtual currencies. It's important to emphasize that the unilateral U.S. declaration of the dollar's decoupling from gold was a major breach of trust by the U.S. government toward other countries. Under the Bretton Woods system, the U.S. promised that 35 U.S. dollars could exchange for 1 ounce of gold. Other countries only needed to reserve U.S. dollars, not gold, which would be uniformly stored by the U.S., and they could exchange it with the U.S. government whenever needed. But suddenly, the U.S. announced that the dollars in hand could no longer be exchanged for gold, and those needing gold had to buy it on the market. This led to a surge in gold prices, rising from $35 per ounce in 1971 to $600 per ounce in 1980. This meant that the foreign exchange reserves of various governments drastically devalued, while the wealth of countries with large gold reserves, such as the US and the UK, sharply increased. You see, through the decoupling of credit money from precious metals, the US completed a new round of global wealth transfer. With the loss of its value anchor, the virtualization and bubble characteristics of the dollar became increasingly apparent. Before the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve's total assets were about $1 trillion. After the crisis, through quantitative easing, the Fed's total assets quickly reached $2.3 trillion. After the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, the Fed initiated a massive flooding of money, with total assets reaching $7.4 trillion, expanding its balance sheet by more than 6 times in 12 years. Graeber wrote this book during the post-2008 round of quantitative easing. He already saw that the massive amount of U.S. government bonds issued were never intended to be repaid, nor could they possibly be repaid. Graeber believed that the trend of dollar virtualization from 1971 to the present marked the beginning of another new stage in human history. What this stage will be called, how long it will last, and where it will take human society, all remain unknown. Okay, that's all for the content of this book. Let's briefly review. First, primitive societies did not engage in systematic bartering, and economic interactions among acquaintances were based on mutual favors. Second, currency did not develop from bartering, but was created and strongly enforced by governments. Third, the history of human civilization is a history of alternating appearances of virtual and physical currencies, and we are currently at the starting point of a new round of virtual currencies. Lastly, let me share an interesting tidbit from the book. We know that Adam Smith's most famous example in The Wealth of Nations is the story of the Scottish pin factory. The pin factory increased production efficiency through labor division. However, Graeber found that 700 years before Smith, the Islamic philosopher Ghazali had described the same story in his work, The Revival of Religious Sciences, involving a pin factory using 25 different processes to produce a pin. However, Ghazali used this story to illustrate the nature of humans helping each other, while Adam Smith used it to illustrate the nature of humans trading with each other. What do you think? Which understanding of human nature is more accurate? That's the essence of this book. You can click the description below the video to find the link to the book. Welcome to read it. You can also share this book with your friends. If you like the content of Daily Book Dive, click the subscribe button to stay updated. Your encouragement helps us continue bringing book essence to our community. Congratulations, you've finished another book.